So the next thing we're going to learn, and we're just kind of getting the basics set up here. This is like the foundation of like how do we actually set up our environment to do the work we want to do. And so one of the things we need to look at are editors, and we just kind of looked at those, IDEs. And the next thing we need to look at is the terminal. And I just want to like give you a little bit of an overview of what the terminal is and how that differs from like how we normally use a computer today and the history of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about graphical user interfaces and command line interfaces. And this might be, I just want to make sure I cover everything from the basics forward. So if there's some people out there that don't have this information, this gets conveyed to them. And if you already know this stuff, skip to the next video. And if you want to just hang out to see what I have to say about it, then that's cool too. But yeah, this is just like the difference between a command line interface and a graphical user interface. So and also I want to say sometimes I'll repeat things a little bit because I forget what I have talked about and what I haven't talked about because I'm teaching here, I'm teaching in the classroom, I'm teaching at the college, I teach at the university, I'm sleep deprived, and it all just like blends together. And I'm like, I know I talked about that recently, I can't remember where. So if I talked about this already before a little bit, then this is another great thing about learning. The more, and I learned this from my dog, the more, if you want something to stick, right, you just need to roll around in it. And the more you roll around in it, the more it sticks. And so if I repeat things a few times, that's just like review. It's a concept which needs to be repeated so that we can continue to learn it. All right, what's the difference between a graphical user interface and command line interface? So graphical user interface is how we interact with computers today. We have graphics, and that's our user interface, the interface by which a user interfaces with the machine. They're a bunch of graphics. And so it's like icons, desktop icons, things we move around with our finger, but those are graphics. And that was actually a really momentous invention and a milestone in modern computing, because before graphical user interfaces, and we abbreviate that and call them GUIs, G-U-I. Before GUIs, we had command line interfaces, and we abbreviate that and we call it CLI, but I don't think anybody says CLI, though they do type it. I'm not sure what you call that, a CLI? I've never heard that. So we have graphical user interfaces, and then before we had GUIs or graphical user interfaces, we had command line interfaces. And a command line interface was like this. It was just like a whole bunch of code that you write, or commands that you give at, a command prompt. And that's it. And that's how people used to interact with computers. Like, I remember my friend Rob in junior high. His family had this computer, and it was like cutting edge, state of the art, so awesome. And it was all command line interface. And so that's the difference between a graphical user interface and command line interface. And we're going to be using a command line interface. And here in a Mac, I type in terminal to bring it up. So we're going to be using a terminal to run some commands and to do some things. And so I just kind of want you to know about the difference between, the terminal and, command line interface and graphical user interface. And there's some terminology disambiguation. Okay, that was a little bit hard for me to say. Terminology disambiguation. Try it a little bit quicker. So we're going to disambiguate a few terms, which you'll hear. Because when I was first getting into all this, I was like, what's the difference between the terminal and the shell and the bash and command prompt and command line interface? They're like all these different words. So on a Mac and on Unix, it's called pretty much the terminal. You'll see here when I bring up Spotlight and I search for it, it's called the terminal on the Mac. Sometimes people refer to it as bash. Sometimes people refer to it as the shell. That's all kind of like those words are more Unix. On Unix, you'll use that. But terminal is what you call it on Mac. And for me, it's also what you call it on Unix. On Windows, it's called the command prompt, right? And to get to it on Windows, you type in CMD. And so if we do command prompt and just enter that, and then hit enter and images, and we look at what we come up with there, you can see here's the command prompt, and that's like totally Windows. It doesn't say it up there, right? But what we're looking at here is Windows, like that type of slashes, those slashes are Windows slashes, right? Command prompt. So on Windows, it's called command prompt. So that's what it's called. All right, so that's what you should be aware of when you see CLI, command line interface. That's what it means. When people talk about doing something at the command prompt or at the terminal, right? They're referring to basically using the command line interface to enter commands. And I don't know what all else I can say about that. I guess the last interesting thing, and definitely stop the video at this point if you don't want just like computer history trivia, was this was another really momentous moment in sort of the story of computers. And it was like Xerox invented the graphical user interface. And they did it at the Palo Alto Research Center, this place called Park. And they said, hey, look, we invented this new way to interact with computers. And they told the executives of Xerox about it. And the executives at Xerox were very unimpressed. They're like, you want people to use a mouse? A mouse? And they just didn't get it. And but then Steve Jobs heard that Xerox had created the graphical user interface. And so he talked to the executives at Xerox, and they said, yeah, go check it out. And so he went over, and Xerox, all the engineers over there, showed Steve Jobs and his engineers how to build a GUI. And then Steve Jobs went back to Apple and created a GUI. and then that's what made Apple really hugely successful. They had the Macintosh with a graphical user interface. And so that's kind of interesting. And then Steve Jobs, Bill Gates saw what Apple did and sort of did that. And Steve Jobs got mad that Bill stole from Apple, even though Steve stole from or took from Xerox, the idea from Xerox. So kind of a funny story, history of computers. That's the command line interface. In the next video, we're going to see the basic commands you need to know for working at the command line interface.